The noise was gone. That was the first thing. No wind moving through fence posts. No distant traffic hum carrying across an open field. The kind that comes when something large is close, pressing the world flat behind it. He stood at the edge of a gravel berm where the embankment began to slope down away from the tracks. The slope ran maybe 8 feet to the flat ground below. Frozen brown grass at the bottom, a row of scrubby trees past that, bare and gray. November had taken most of what color the leaves had left, and what remained was just the skeleton of a tree line telling him which direction the creek ran. He didn't go toward the trees. He stood and looked at the concrete. It was old concrete, gray going to nearly black where the ground had been wet and stayed wet over years and years. The wall of the embankment. He could see where the block faces had been poured in sections. The seams staggered the way a mason does it, though the mason who did this work had been gone a long time. There were rust stains running down from somewhere above. Orange lines tracing the path water had taken down the face of the wall. He read those lines for a moment. Read what they said about where water came from up there. Then he saw the gap, not a crack, not a break, a gap. Something intentional, set low in the wall, maybe 18 inches above the ground, wide enough that he could make out a rectangle of shadow behind it even in the gray afternoon light. The shadow was absolute. Whatever was in there hadn't seen daylight in a while, maybe hadn't seen it since the thing was built, and the concrete around the opening was clean of rust stains, which meant water went in and not out, which meant whatever was inside wasn't draining the way the rest of the wall drained. He walked down the slope sideways, keeping his weight low, the gravel shifting under his boots but not giving way. At the bottom, he stood up straight and crossed the dead grass to the wall. Up close, the opening was taller than it had looked, maybe 2 feet tall, 3 feet wide. The metal hatch that had covered it was still attached at the hinge on the right side, bent outward and resting against the wall face at an angle, as if someone had forced it and then walked away. The hinge bolts were still in the concrete. The hatch itself was heavy-gauge steel, painted at some point with a red oxide primer that had gone brown and then almost black. He put his hand on it, cold through his glove, real weight when he shifted it. He left it where it was and looked into the opening. No sound came out. He got down on one knee in the dead grass, then the other, and leaned in until his head was past the concrete lip. The smell before anything else. Not rot, not standing water, something dry and mineral, like old concrete with the memory of something chemical in it. Maybe old diesel or old lubricating grease from machinery that had been in there and was in there no longer. Clean in the way that closed spaces sometimes stay clean when nothing living gets inside for long enough. He held that for a moment before his eyes adjusted. The space opened up, not wide, maybe 5 feet across, but the ceiling was higher than the opening suggested. He could tell by the sound his own breathing made coming back at him, the way it returned from a distance. He pulled out his flashlight and put the beam in. The floor was concrete, dry, flat with a slight grade toward the center where a drain sat, the drain covered with a round cast iron plate, the plate rimmed with old mineral deposits the color of pale chalk. The walls were the same poured concrete as the outside, but in here the texture was finer, smoother, and someone had at some point painted them. Gray paint, long since chalking off in places, but the surface underneath was sound. No cracks he could see. The ceiling was low at the edges and higher in the center, a barrel vault, maybe 7 feet at the crown. He moved the light slowly and the vault moved with it, the shadows rolling across the curved surface. 12 feet, maybe 14 deep. He didn't say anything. He stayed on his knees in the cold grass for a long time and said nothing and looked. He went back up the slope to where he'd left his pack and sat down on the gravel with his back against one of the creosote-soaked rail ties that edged the berm. He could feel the cold coming through his jacket where the tie pressed against his spine. He ate half a sandwich from wax paper and drank some water and looked back down at the gap in the wall. The thing he kept returning to was the drain. A drain meant that water had been expected. Not a small amount of water, not just the seep you get through any crack, but enough water that someone had planned for it when they built the space. That meant the space was designed to receive something, or to be cleaned, or both. He didn't know what had been in here. He didn't know when the rail line had been built or what the structure served. The hatch, with its red oxide primer and its heavy-gauge steel, suggested utility, not access. The kind of door that gets checked on, not entered regularly. He finished the sandwich, wrapped the wax paper tight and put it in his side pocket. Whatever it had been used for before, it was empty now and had been for a long time. The bolt threads on the hatch had been rusted solid. He'd had to put his full weight into the flashlight just to break the beam of light through the gap without pushing the hatch further. No recent disturbance in the dust at the opening's edge. No recent anything. He was cold sitting there. The temperature had been dropping since around 2 in the afternoon, and it was past 4 now. He could tell by the light more than by any clock. The quality of it had shifted from flat gray to something thinner and more horizontal. The sun already below the tree line somewhere to the southwest. The sky above the embankment going from white to a pale color with no good name for it. He picked up his pack and went back down the slope. He went in feet first, on his stomach, his pack left outside against the wall. His boots hit the floor. He worked his hips through the opening, then his chest, and then he was inside and he stood up and the crown of the vault was maybe a foot above his head. He put both hands flat on it. The concrete was cold, but not as cold as the outside air. Whatever temperature this space held, it held it. The ground hadn't frozen in here. He crouched down and pressed his palm to the floor. The floor was only a little colder than his hand. He moved the flashlight across the full interior. At the far end, set into the wall, was a pipe. Iron pipe 4 inches across, capped. Below the cap, a stain on the wall where something had dripped for a long time and then stopped. Not water staining, something darker, something that had dried black and stayed that way. He didn't go near it yet. He noted it and moved the light on. The side walls had 2 brackets each, irons set into the concrete at about shoulder height. The kind of bracket that holds a shelf or a plank or a piece of equipment on a mount. He rocked the nearest one with his hand. It didn't move. The bolts were set deep, the concrete around them uncracked. Along the left wall, near the opening end, a low concrete ledge ran the width of the space, maybe 1.5 feet high, 2 feet deep. Not a step, not a drain surround. Built in, part of the original pour. He sat on it. It held him without any flex or groan, just concrete and silence. He turned the flashlight off and sat in the dark for a while. The silence in here was different from the silence outside. Outside there had been absence, the absence of traffic, of wind. In here there was something more like insulation. He could feel the weight of the embankment above him through the ceiling, through the walls, the whole mass of rock and packed earth and rail ballast and steel rail pressing down and outward into the ground. That weight was what kept the temperature. That weight was what kept the sound out. He understood something then, sitting in the dark on the concrete ledge, that he hadn't quite understood before he came inside. This was already a room. He spent 2 days in the town 2 miles east. He came back with what he could carry in a single load: a roll of closed-cell foam sleeping pad, a pound of roofing tar in a can, 3 small hinges, a box of concrete screws and the bit to drive them, a short pry bar, 2 lengths of furring strip, a folded piece of heavy canvas, and 40 feet of paracord. He'd bought the roofing tar and the screws at a salvage yard for $3.40. The foam pad he'd found folded in a dumpster behind a discount furniture store. The canvas had been a tarp draped over a pallet of something outside a building supply. The tarp left there so long the pallet had rotted out from under it. He folded the canvas tight and strapped it under the pack's top lid. He brought food too, dry food, oats, dried beans, a bag of rice, some dried fruit, salt, and a small bottle of oil. A pot, a metal cup, a lighter, a single candle in a glass jar with a lid. Everything he brought in through the hatch opening, piece by piece, then himself. The hatch was the first problem. The hinge was good. It moved on its pin without seizing, which surprised him given the rust on the surface. He worked it back and forth a dozen times to feel for binding. No binding. The problem was the way the hatch lay when open. The angle it rested at let rain run down the wall and pool at the opening. He needed it to close, and he needed it to close tight enough to seal out drafts. He cleaned the concrete lip around the opening first, scraping the loose material with the pry bar, working the mortar joints until they were clean. Then he packed the gaps with roofing tar, working it in with a stick, filling the voids between the hatch frame and the wall face. He let that sit while he worked on something else. He built a shelf from the 2 furring strips, using the iron brackets on the left wall. The strips were a tight fit between the brackets, and he wedged them in without screws, testing the weight by pressing down hard with both hands. The shelf held. He set the pot and the cup and the food bags on it, distributing the weight evenly, and the shelf sat level and still. The candle in the jar he set on the concrete ledge near the opening. He lit it and watched the flame. It burned straight. No draft. Good. He lay the foam pad on the floor against the left wall below the shelf. The pad was 1.5 inches of closed-cell foam, which meant it wouldn't compress much under him and wouldn't pass cold up from the concrete the way open-cell foam will. He lay on it on his back and looked at the vault above him. The candle threw moving shadows across the curve of the ceiling. The temperature inside had risen a little already, just from him being in there and the candle burning. Small space, sealed at the opening end, insulated on all sides by earth. The candle wouldn't do much, maybe 2 or 3 degrees, but in a small sealed space, 2 or 3 degrees is something you can feel. He lay there until the candle had burned 1.5 inches down the glass. He thought, this will do. He didn't think anything else about it. He closed his eyes. In the morning, what he noticed first was the cold outside. He'd slept in his clothes and his jacket, and when he worked the hatch open from inside and put his head out into the air had gone hard overnight. The kind of cold that has weight to it, that presses on the skin of your face and doesn't let up. The grass was stiff and white. His breath made a cloud, and the cloud hung for a moment before dissolving. Inside, when he pulled the hatch shut behind him and listened, the temperature was what it had been the night before. Cold, but a dry, still cold, not the cutting kind. He could work in here without his gloves. He needed a way to cook. The iron pipe in the far wall bothered him until he figured out what it was. He stood in front of it for a long time that second morning, looking at it. The dark stain below the cap, the way the pipe angled slightly upward as it went into the wall. Then he understood. Ventilation. This space had been designed with 1 inlet and 1 exhaust. The inlet was the hatch. The exhaust was that pipe angled up through the embankment to some opening in the surface, or maybe along the side of the embankment near the track bed. He didn't know where it exited, but it exited somewhere because when he put his palm near the cap, he could feel a faint draw of air. Not a current. A suggestion. He unscrewed the cap with the pry bar slipped under the flange. It came off with a sound like a held breath releasing. The draw of air increased, not much but enough to feel. He built a small fire on the drain plate. Not from wood, he didn't want smoke he couldn't control. He used the can lid from the roofing tar, cleaned out, filled with a small amount of the oil he'd brought, and a wick made from a strip of canvas. A lamp, essentially. Small flame, almost no smoke, and the draw in the pipe pulled what little there was across the space and up and out. He put the pot on the 2 furring strips, balanced across them above the lamp. He made oats. They took longer than on a proper stove, and he had to keep adjusting the pot so it didn't tip. But the water came to a simmer, and the oats cooked through, and he ate them hot from the pot with a spoon and some salt and a handful of the dried fruit. He hadn't eaten a hot meal in 4 days. He sat on the concrete ledge after and held the empty pot in his hands for the warmth of the metal, and outside, faintly through the concrete above him, he could hear a train passing. The sound came through the earth as a long, low vibration rather than a noise. He could feel it in the ledge under him, in the wall behind him, in the floor. The whole space hummed quietly for maybe 40 seconds and then went still. He sat and held the pot. The weeks after that had a shape to them that he hadn't planned. He left in the mornings when he needed to and came back before dark. The days he worked were the days he needed supplies or needed to earn a little money, and he found both in town, the town to the east, where there was a salvage operation that took day labor and paid cash at 4 in the afternoon. He worked 2 days, 3 days, never 5. 5 days in a row at the salvage yard meant people started asking questions, started treating you like a regular, and regular was a different kind of problem than stranger. What he brought back from those days went into the space in order of necessity. First, a better way to hold the hatch closed from inside, a simple hook and eye set into the concrete. The hook drilled in with the concrete screws and set with a dab of tar. Then a second foam pad for the ledge, thinner, so the ledge became something closer to a bench with cushion. Then a piece of closed-cell foam glued with roofing tar to the inside face of the hatch, so the hatch sealed when it closed and the draft that had crept in at the lower left corner stopped. The improvement that mattered most came from nowhere he expected. He'd found a piece of aluminum flashing at the salvage yard, a scrap maybe 2 feet by 3 feet, slightly curved from having been rolled on a spool. He hadn't known what he wanted it for. He carried it back because it was light and the salvage foreman had told him to take whatever he wanted from the scrap pile, and he'd walked the pile twice before his hand closed on the flashing, and he'd rolled it tighter and fit it inside his pack. 3 days later he understood why. He bent the flashing into a reflector and mounted it behind the oil lamp with 2 of the concrete screws run through drilled holes at the top. The reflector caught the lamp's heat and threw it forward into the space. It also caught the light and threw that forward, and the difference in brightness was enough that he didn't need the candle in the jar anymore for the hours he spent inside before sleeping. He could read by the lamp and reflector together. He had 2 paperback books, both picked up from a box outside a thrift store. He read them both twice. The space by then had the quality of somewhere that had been used. The shelf had a water ring from the pot. The ledge had a depression in the foam where he sat. The floor near the hatch had scuff marks from his boots, small things. They were there now whether he looked at them or not. He didn't think about that much, he thought about the next practical problem, which was always the next practical problem. There was a problem he hadn't solved yet, and it nagged at him the way small unsolved things do when you have a lot of time and a quiet place to sit with them. The moisture, his breath, the lamp, the oil burning low. All of it put water into the air. In a small sealed space, the water had nowhere to go except the walls and the ceiling and the floor. After the first cold week, he noticed it on the vault above him. Not dripping, not pooling, but a faint darkening of the concrete in the center of the arch. The kind of dampness you see when you breathe on glass. The concrete was absorbing it. For now that was fine, but concrete absorbs up to a point, and past that point it releases, and he needed to give the moisture somewhere to go before it found the foam pad and found his sleeping bag, and made both of them a problem. He kept the pipe open at night. Even in the coldest nights, he kept it open a crack, the cap left loose enough that air was still drawing through. The draw was slow, but it was steady, and it pulled the damp air across the space and out. He could check the vault each morning by running his hand across the crown of the arch, and after the first week of doing this, the dampness stopped increasing. Held at the same level. Then, slowly, over the following 2 weeks, it retreated until the concrete above him was dry to the touch. He never opened the pipe wide. Wide meant cold air dropping in faster than the space could warm it, which meant burning more oil, which meant more trips to town for oil. The crack he left was enough. He learned the feel of how much to leave it by the temperature on his face when he woke up. Too cold meant the pipe was open too far, and he'd reach over in the dark and set the cap another thread tighter without getting up from the pad. That balance, once he found it, held through November. December came in with 3 days of sleet. He knew it was sleep from the sound, not through the walls, through the pipe in the far wall, which when the weather was moving hard carried a faint hiss that wasn't airflow. He lay on the foam pad and listened to it, the sleet hiss in the pipe, and he thought about the opening somewhere up above where the pipe met the outside air, and whether it was covered and whether the sleet would seal it over. He put his hand near the open pipe end, and the draw was still there, still drawing. He kept the lamp burning a little higher that night. The wick turned up 1 thread's width, and the oil burned down faster than usual, and the space stayed warm enough. Outside, that first night of the sleet, the temperature went to somewhere below 20 degrees. He knew this not because he had a thermometer, but because his water bottle, which he kept near the opening end of the space, had a skin of ice on top of it in the morning. Not solid ice, a skin. The inside of the space had held enough warmth that the ice was only at the surface of the water and only on the side of the bottle facing the hatch. He broke the skin with his thumb and drank. That was December. The sleet came back twice more before Christmas, and once there was snow, and he watched the snow through the gap when the hatch was open a few inches, the flakes coming down thick and slow in the still air below the embankment, settling on the dead grass and on the bare dirt and on the concrete wall around the hatch opening and not coming inside because the hatch overhang was enough of a roof to keep the opening clear. He thought about a proper stove for a moment. Then he didn't. The temperature in the space held at something between 38 and 45 degrees depending on the outside cold, which he knew because he could feel the difference between 38 and 45 on the skin of his face, even if he couldn't measure it. 38 felt like refrigeration. 45 felt like a coat was enough. He slept well at 45. He slept in his sleeping bag at 38 and kept the lamp burning on a low setting through the night. He'd been in worse places in January. He had been in much worse places. What he didn't expect was the quiet getting ordinary. He'd been in the space for 6 weeks before he noticed that the train, which ran twice a day in the early morning and once in late afternoon, had stopped being something he heard and became instead something he felt as a background fact, the way people who live near a highway stop registering the highway. The vibration through the floor, the low hum through the walls. He stopped waiting for it. His body just knew when it was coming, knew the gap, knew the 40 seconds, and had stopped treating it as news. He didn't know what to do with that information exactly. He lay on the foam pad one night in the middle of January with the lamp low and the oil nearly gone. He'd thought, back in November, that this was a night or two. Then he'd thought he'd leave before the real cold. The real cold had come and gone, and he was still here. He thought about why he hadn't moved. He didn't finish that thought. He turned on his side, put his face toward the wall, and closed his eyes. He stayed through February. He hadn't planned on February. He'd thought in late January that he might head south, not urgently, not with any particular place in mind, but south was warmer and warmer was easier, and he'd been thinking about easier the way you do when the cold has been going for a long time. But the days in late January turned and started towards something less hard, and by the first week of February the temperature inside the space was sitting at 45 most mornings without the lamp burning through the night. And he had oil, and he had dry food, and going south required energy that the winter had taken some of. He stayed. February was the month he found the second hatch. He'd been outside on a morning when the light was good, working along the base of the embankment wall looking for cracks he should tar before the spring wet came, moving slowly with his hand on the concrete face, feeling for places where the surface had gone hollow or where the mortar in the seams had opened up. He'd moved maybe 30 feet north along the wall from the opening before he felt the change in the concrete face, a section that gave back a different sound when he pressed his knuckle against it. Not hollow, but different. He looked at it. The concrete was slightly different in color here, a shade lighter and slightly rougher in surface texture, the way new concrete poured against old concrete always looks when you know what to look for. A repair, a big one. Whatever had been here before had been filled in. A larger opening maybe, or a section of the wall that had failed and been poured new. He stood and looked at it for a while, the repaired section maybe 4 feet wide and 6 feet tall, and he thought about what had been here before the pour. And he thought about what might still be on the other side of it. He didn't investigate further. He wasn't going to break into a repair that was holding the embankment together above him. But he stood and looked at it for a long time anyway. On the way back, he noticed that the dead grass below the repair was a slightly different color than the grass to either side, browner, more compressed, as if water had come through there in the past and left minerals in the soil. What had been here before that pour had let water out? A drain, maybe. A second access point. He stood there in the cold February morning and thought about what this embankment had been before it was just an embankment, what it had been used for, what had gone in and come out of it in the years before he was alive. He had no way to know. He noted it. That was February. The cold came back once more in the last week of the month, a hard cold that dropped the temperature inside below 40 for 3 days. And he burned the lamp high and ate hot food twice a day and read his paperback books for the 3rd time each, and waited. The cold released on a morning when the light through the crack in the hatch was a different color than it had been. He noticed the color before he was fully awake. Something in it had changed. A quality that wasn't brightness exactly, but was something adjacent to brightness. Something that made the thin line of light look like it had been there all along and was only now showing what it was. He opened the hatch and sat up on the ledge of the opening with his legs outside and his back inside and his face in the sun. The air was still cold, but it was not the same cold. He sat like that for a long time, long enough that the frost on the grass in front of him melted in a slow widening ring outward from where the sun hit it, and the grass under the frost was not brown anymore, but a pale and uncertain green, the kind of green that isn't sure yet of itself. He had enough oil for 2 more nights and he needed to go into town. He laced his boots, pulled the hatch shut behind him, and walked north along the base of the embankment toward the gap in the fence he used for the road. The frost crunched once under his boots and then it didn't anymore.